Kevin?
Okay.
I'm just starting the webinar.
Okay. Good evening, comrades. Apologies for a slightly delayed start due to a little bit of technical incompetence on my part. Welcome to this evening's session as part of the Why Marx series. This evening is the first of three sessions, and we're looking at the topic of Marx and democracy. And it has a certain historical element to it, in that the three sessions take three sort of decisive points in Marx's development, by Marx and Engels, of course, beginning in the period when Marx is moving from being a radical Democrat to becoming a communist. And that's broadly in the 1840s, early 1840s. That will be this evening. And we've got two comrades speaking, Steve Freeman from the Republican Labour Working Group and Luke Pickrell from the Marxist Unity Group in the United States. And next week's session we'll look at the 1848 revolutions, and then the third session will look at the Paris Commune and after. So tonight's session, I think, is will be a very interesting one. It's quite an important topic, partly because it's a way of tracing the development of Marx's ideas, but also looking at some aspects of Marxism which many comrades are possibly less familiar with, but in particular to look at the relationship in Marx's own thought and later his political practice, ideas of democracy. And in particular, the relationship of democracy to ideas of class struggle, and indeed the way that we might try to understand Marx's trajectory. We often begin our understandings of Marx, many comrades, probably their first introduction to Marx as a Marx and Engels was the Communist Manifesto, which is written in 1847-48. And that's some time really after Marx and Engels have been sort of developing their ideas. And it's often fascinating to look at where they come from, particularly as in philosophical, in other terms, Marxism does bear very much the sort of cradle marks of that, no pun intended, of that type of development. Anyway, I'll hand over now to Steve Freeman and Luke Pickrell. They'll explain how we're going to work this session. The general format will be, I think, fairly familiar to comrades. The comrades will have a structured discussion, and then we'll throw it open to questions. Comrades should use the reactions button, the raise hand, if they want to come in to ask questions or make comments. Okay, Steve, over to you.
Thank you. Get that up. Thanks, Kevin. What I was going to do, you'll just see from this, just to say we were doing in the Republican Labour Working Group a whole series on the idea of citizen Marx, based on a thesis by Bruno Leopold, and we hope to get him to come and speak soon. But I'm drawing quite a bit on his work, so I must give him full credit, but not entirely so. I thought what I would do, first of all, just to introduce, before I get onto the 1840s, 1842, 1843, which is the main thing I'm going to talk about, I wanted to raise some issues from today, because we're not doing this for history, we're doing it to think about where we are today. So the first thing I wanted to suggest to you, okay, and I think this is my way of looking at it, it may not be yours, but I tend to see communism as a broad idea, and at one extreme there are what I would call Republican communists, and at another extreme anarcho-communists. So we need to clarify, if that's the case, we need to clarify what is the distinction between them. So I thought, well, okay, I'll express it like this. Republican communism wants to replace the existing state with a democratic republic, whereas anarcho-communism wants to abolish the existing state. And I thought of Bakunin being an example of an anarcho-communist. So an anarcho-communist would want to abolish the monarchy, as would a Republican communist, but the Republican communist emphasizes the importance of the democratic republic. And if you think about it, you could, if you don't like the word Republican, and some people don't like that word, you could think of it as political communism. In other words, in a certain sense, an emphasis on the state, on democracy, on the constitution, laws, rights, and liberties, all those aspects that sometimes get neglected among socialists. But Republican communists tend to emphasize those points. I think there's another theoretical point as well that I'd want to say, and this is having looked at the history of republicanism, it's certainly the case that it's generally accepted that between feudalism and capitalism, there was a kind of republicanism. We can think of England, we can think of the United States and France. That type of republicanism is sometimes called classic republicanism, sometimes it's called bourgeois republicanism, sometimes it's called aristocratic republicanism, getting rid of the aristocratic rule and creating a bourgeois republic. Republican communists might think this, however, that there's a different kind of republicanism that will help us to make that transition from capitalism to communism. So that's not in the normal way that people think about it. And I'd like to throw that up for a kind of discussion. In other words, people sometimes say, if you say, well, what about republicanism? You say, well, we just want to get rid of the aristocracy and the monarchy. No, that's something that didn't happen a long time ago. Democratic republicanism is something else. It's something about, and you could say, well, democratic republicanism is about the working class. It's not about the bourgeoisie getting from feudalism to capitalism. So let us think a little bit about about where we are today in this country, where we are. So I might describe the democratic question here a little bit along those lines. We had a constitutional monarchy and a union state from 1680, was formed in the late 17th, early 18th century. And our politics was shaped by the Whigs and the Tories. Well, apparently we don't have Whigs and Tories anymore, but I'll put a couple of tram lines down there. So all of our politics works within the tram lines of that constitution. It's changed a lot since 1688, of course it has. And the ways we might recognize it, very important in our own history, is the post-war settlement, the 1945, what I call the social monarchy, a social and constitutional monarchy, plus the welfare state. We've all been brought up in that post-war, under that post-war settlement. The BBC, the NHS, the Queen, all very important symbols of that post-war period. And of course, we don't have Tories and Whigs anymore. We have the Conservative and Unionist Party and the Labour Party, and they're all working within those tram lines. So politics is taking place within that two-party system. And I think if you think, well, what's outside of it? There's fascism on one side and republicanism on the other. Well, fascism, we haven't really had fascism. We could think of the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. We could think of the Irish Republicans in the 1920s, all that kind of outside the tram lines of normal politics. But I think that now we are in a special period. My argument is that we are in an epoch of a deep crisis, because not only did Thatcher, beginning with Thatcher, neoliberalism dismantle much of our social monarchy, privatized it, deregulated it. But since 2008 and the banking crisis, you could argue that we've gone into a state of degeneration. A state of degeneration, I'm thinking of something dying, failing, putrefying, breaking down, being corrupted, debased, degraded, declined, regressing, disintegrating, deteriorating. I don't think you can think of any institution today. Every day is going by and some form of degeneration is taking place. Only yesterday we had the state of the Metropolitan Police, but we could have just gone around and talked about the prisons. We could have gone around and talked about anything you like. So our constitution, there we see Boris Johnson on trial yesterday. Our liberal democracy is in a crisis, and our welfare state is in a deep crisis. And none of us here, sitting here have ever seen anything like it in our lives. And I'm wondering whether the centre can hold in this situation, or whether we're getting, or whether we will get, in fact, I'll predict that we're going to get a polarisation, because we can think of the Tory party being in a deep crisis in a way that we've never seen it before. And we could think of the Labour Party also undergoing a deep crisis. And we've talked about the state of the Labour Party many times. You could argue that Corbyn was a response to that crisis. And so maybe, and this is what I'm going to throw out for discussion, you'll see my red lines have now become dotted lines, that maybe the barriers are going to be breaking down in that polarization. And maybe we're going to face the threat of fascism. Many people have said we've got creeping fascism. What's on the other side? Maybe it's the Republic. So maybe we'll get a polarization between fascism on one side and republicanism on the other, both breaking the traditional mold. Now, people will say, well, I can see the fascism, I can't see any republicanism. So there's none of that. But we just seen Boris Johnson. If we've got a Mussolini in this country, surely it's going to be, as it were, Boris Johnson. Now, I'm going to come back to this before I start. We're going back to look at why Marx. So what would we do then? You know, fascism or republic? Should we oppose fascism and warn of the danger? Should we defend the degenerated social monarchy and the union? Should we become the vanguard of the Republic? So at that point, I say, well, let's go back to Marx and Engels. Let's go back into history and see what they can tell us about the present situation. And ask the question, was Marx a Republican communist or not? And so that leads us back to the beginning, really. Why Marx? So the thing that we will, I think, go to discuss is, what did Marx say about democracy and republicanism? The next three sessions, that's already been explained. But the thesis that Bruner has, and I go along with it, is that Marx was a Republican at the beginning. He, as an antithesis, if you like, became a communist, appeared to abandon republicanism for communism. And then I think the synthesis would have been, he becomes a Republican communist around about the time of the Paris Commune. He kind of rediscovers it. He doesn't ever lose his republicanism, because I think it's always an important strand in his politics. So I want to argue that republicanism is not just something in our history, but it's something that's going to be relevant and important to us today. And that's the reason why you want to look into history and look into the theory to see what the development of Marx's ideas had for us. Now, at that point, I think that point was my introduction. I'm going to go over to the actual specific period of the 1840s, and I think I might ask Luke to say something. I will go off the screen share at this point. And we'll go, let's take the screen share down a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. There's a lot to talk about there. And I'm also conscious of kind of needing to limit myself to this period prior to 1848, because certainly we can talk about Marxism and democracy and republicanism from, the very moment he was born up until, our present day. I have a few questions here, and I know, Kevin might come in and ask us some questions as well. But starting, with Marx's birth, maybe we can go a little bit prior, and I'm kind of curious how you would kind of describe the world before Marx as it relates to these ideas.
I think the first thing I'd want to say is that I think the most important thing to understand Marx's world is, of course, the French Revolution. It's an event of such world historic. I mean, that's what Hegel described the French Revolution as, a world historic event that shapes politics. The young Hegel was very enthusiastic about the revolution, and that fed all his philosophical reflections and writings. The Revolution of 1789, the Republic of 1793. Probably the most significant events of the 19th century, just in the same way as we think about the Russian Revolution, people then thought about the French Revolution. And in a way, France between 1790 and 1840 provides a microcosm of all the states that we can see. Because if you think about it, France started out as an autocratic monarchy, then it became a republic, then it became under Napoleon a dictatorship, then the Bourbons were restored in 1814 as a kind of dictatorship under Louis XVIII and Charles X, before being overthrown in 1830 by a popular revolution that transferred power to the July monarchy of Louis Philippe. So in that one country, you've got all of the states. If we were to zoom out on a Google map and look down on Europe and the world, we'd see a republic, we'd see a constitutional monarchy in Britain, we'd see a republic in America, we'd see absolute monarchies in Prussia, in Austria, and in Russia. So in a sense, everything that happened in France was kind of was the shape of Europe as well at that time. And I want to say one other thing. And of course, in that view, a lot of politics, America stood at one extreme to Russia. America was seen as the more progressive place, and Russia was the backward force of reaction. And I want to add one other point I think is important to this, which I will say is working class republicanism. The French workers in 1831, there was a struggle of the Lyons silk workers fighting for better terms and conditions in the face of the threats to their work. And the King Louis Philippe sent 20,000 soldiers to suppress them. And the rebels were displaying black and red flags against the Royalist army. Their slogan was, live free working or die fighting. And then in 1834, the same thing happened again in Lyons. 6 days, it required 12,000 soldiers to suppress them. The week of blood, 200 people, civilians were executed or shot. But this time, the uprising took a political turn, and the workers put forward republic. It was fueled by local conditions, but they put forward Republican demands and Republican slogans. And in this way, they connected their dispute to a wider dispute with in other cities. Riots broke out in other cities, in Grenoble, Marseille, Paris, and other such places. And so Marx recognizes this. He says something about it later. We'll come back to it later. But it's a time when you can say the working class became the vanguard of the struggle for republic, not the bourgeoisie, but the working class. And you could say the defeat of the Lyons workers in 1834 was merely, let's say, a rehearsal for 1848, because in 1848 it was, as we'll see next time, where the working class came forward on the Republican question. So I think those things are the background to Marx. He finishes university in 1841 and becomes editor. So that's my first bit. I think those are things that one could take into account in understanding where Marx was as he comes.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Lyon uprising. You know, I'm looking here at a page, the King of Prussia and social reforms, and he says, you know, talking about the Silesian Rebellion, which also influences him. You know, he says the Silesian Rebellion starts where the French and English workers finished. So he's definitely drawing, you know, a through line through that. And the French Revolution being very important. I mean, I know folks like Richard Hunt have written about how the ideas of Marx's father, kind of being a liberal monarchist, really came from the French Revolution and had an early impact on him. There's a lot to go into there, and maybe we can continue at some point. But I'm also curious about this idea of Marx being a Republican and not a communist. And one thing I think that's interesting is to note that Marx actually talked about communism before he was a communist. We sometimes forget that that communism did not start from the moment Marx said, "I am a communist." So I'm curious if you could talk about that.
Yes,
Republican,
okay.
not a communist.
So Marx left university, became the editor of a radical liberal paper, the Rheinische Zeitung, in 1842, and he was struggling to survive under Prussian state censorship. And so the issues he was very much concerned about was free speech, censorship, autocratic government. And then in March 1843, the Prussian government shuts the newspaper down. And so these ideas about democracy and freedom, they're the center of Marx's thinking at the time. He says, at one point, he has this quote in, it's called Brief Weschel von 1843, but he has this quote, says, as for human beings, that would imply thinking beings, free men, republicans. And so his idea is that freedom, humanity, being conscious, thinking people, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, political action, that's all the kind of spirit of republicanism. But Marx wasn't a communist, and he was actually quite critical of the existing communists, and he gives 4 reasons why he doesn't support it. And I'll just briefly say what they are. He first of all says that the socialists have mistakenly identified socialism with the suppression of property, and he thinks his ideas don't fit with that. He says communism has a tendency towards utopianism, building ideal models of communist societies like Robert Owen and so on, rather than critiquing existing society, which is the essence of where Marx is going to come from. He tends to think that communism is sectarianism, unable to build a broad political coalitions of mass parties and things of that type. And he thinks that the communists and socialists are economistic in the sense that they seem to think that political questions, he says, are unworthy of attention. They're not interested in political and constitutional matters, and Marx clearly is. So it's clear he's definitely a Democrat. He's definitely you could describe him, I suppose, as a Democrat, a humanist, a radical, but not a communist. But before moving on to find out what part of his republicanism carries on, I think we're going into that point of transition from this point where he starts to do some writing and thinking, and I'll come on to that in next. But the two things I want to mention is the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and the Jewish question that I'll come on to a little bit later. But 2 very important texts, which I was struggling to read the first one because, wow, that's a tricky one. But anyway, let's finish that point there. So he's clearly is a Republican and a Democrat, but not a communist at this point.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it's making me think. There's an academic in the United States, Sean Monahan, who talks about the U.S. workers' movement, and I know we don't have time necessarily to get into the influence that the U.S. has, but what he says is that the U.S. working class, which is very much interested in politics and forming working class political parties, are very actually critical of the European socialists because they are dismissive of politics. And they basically say to them, you're missing out if you're dismissive of politics. And I'm also thinking, perhaps maybe one of the reasons Marx looked critically at the existing utopian, socialist, however communist movements you want to call them, is precisely because he was interested in democracy. And so many of these earlier socialist communist movements were actually very anti-democratic. And I think we tend to forget that.
And look, I was going to add a point to that. Just say why Marx was naturally attracted to the to the Chartists, by the way. But that's it just made me think of that point. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I know you mentioned those other 2 texts, and so now I'm kind of curious about Marx's republicanism, kind of starting in maybe this 1843 period, and then his idea of the democratic republic, perhaps bringing that in as well.
Okay, so to remember that Europe has got Europe at this time has got absolute monarchies. It's got constitutional monarchies in France and Britain, and it's got the republic now in America. Those are the kind of the world in which we're operating. Well, in Hegel's philosophy of right was kind of revolutionary in one way and conservative. Hegel supported constitutional monarchy, which he believed was the best form of government. So the radical Hegelians, known as the young Hegelians, including Bruno Bauer, Arnold Rouge, Ludwig Feuerbach, Moses Hess, and Marx himself, took up a Republican standpoint, associating with their ideas of republicanism with the ideas of freedom and liberty and liberation. So it was the young Hegelians taking up cudgels, as it were, against Hegel's ideas of support. Now, republicanism, therefore, was central to the young Hegelians. So when Marx wrote his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, it was a highly developed political criticism of Hegel. And when you read it, he goes through it he quotes Hegel and goes through it line by line. But in there, he talks about the constitution, the crown, the executive, and the legislature. And he goes through, I mean, it's not an easy read. Some people said that he never intended to be published. And I've been trying to read it and find it's not an easy read. There's another one called The Introduction to this, which I thought was the bit that went before, but in fact, it was written afterwards, and it was the introduction to this thing is actually a better read or an easier read. And it's more, but anyway, I'll just take up one of those things, which is the crown. And then I will go and look at his theory of a democratic republic. So Marx does this detailed analysis of Hegel line by line. I mean, the simplest way to understand the crown is to think of God, God being the supreme being. People pray to God, they obey the will of God or God's laws. For Marx, behind God is man, who invented God to mask as a mask for human actions. So some humans speak to us not as equals, but from above through the mystical disguise of God as an external force. God is for a loss of sovereignty. Now, Marx doesn't talk so much about that, but he talks about the crown can be seen in a similar way as an abstract power. People are in awe of the crown and loyal to it and obey its laws, but the crown is not a thing, it's but a human invention, a mask to conceal real people and the power that stands behind it. And this power stands before us dressed up in regal clothes as the king or the queen. But we're told repeatedly here anyway that the king has no power except for ceremony. But Marx is clear that the crown is really a loss of sovereignty by the people, a surrender of power. It's just a measure that we've given up or we don't have that power. And the crown, therefore, is not one person, not one man or one woman, but a mask for class rule, a rule by a powerful oligarchy acting in the interests of a definite class of landowners and capitalists. The crown is a means of concealing and mystifying class rule. But then, of course, the republic doesn't end class rule, it just makes it more transparent. So there's not an illusion there in the republic, it's the republic just makes everything more open, I suppose, or more obvious. Now, I don't know how you're living in a republic, Luke, whether you'd agree with that, I don't know, but we have a level of mystification but anyway, so the point about this is that Marx opposes any kind of monarchy and he supports the American Republican model against any kind of monarchy. Yet at the same time, he becomes a Republican critic of the American model and sees some of its limitations. So his criticism of the Republic is coming from the left, from a more democratic idea of republicanism. But he's not interested about whether we have an absolute monarchy or a constitutional one, as far as he's concerned. That's all out. So I just put that in, that's an element, because we can't cover everything. So that's just one element from the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, or my interpretation of it anyway.
Yeah, well, it's, you talk about kind of mystification and maybe, giving a figure or an object certain powers, and then forgetting, of course, that, well, the king is only as powerful as, the people see it as a king, see him or her as a king or a queen. And it makes me think, here in the United States, we have our Constitution. And it's interesting enough, folks might not know that Marx was actually very interested in constitutions, and it's in also, his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right that he writes this, and I'll just read it briefly. He asks, does a people have the right to give itself a new constitution?
Yeah.
The answer must be an unqualified yes, because the constitution becomes a practical illusion the moment it ceases to be a true expression of the people's will. And it's interesting, thinking about the document, that came in that was here in the United States prior to our Constitution, expressly stated more or less that there cannot be something like the Constitution written. That would be an illegal act. But of course, the people then just came together and decided to do it. And once it was done, it was done, and that power was put out there. You could then say put out there and then taken away, perhaps. But I see lots of ties, between your description of Britain and the United States. So just thinking, about this other text you mentioned, the Jewish question, and then perhaps also touching on kind of a turn from republicanism to communism. I know you've been talking about that a fair bit.
Yeah, I want to just divert myself, though, Luke, into just talking a little bit about Marx's theory, because there's an idea in there, and you can't really understand the Jewish question without it, I think.
Sure.
So I'm just going to go back to Marx's theory of the democratic republic. Well, at that point, what does he actually do when he's doing this work? I mean, in a way. So I think that Marx's theory of a democratic republic, what he does as part of this process of this critique of Hegel's philosophy, right? He sets out. It's a bit like what he did with Capital when he read all the political economists in England and so on. He goes back to look at all the history of. He looks back into history of ancient Greece, to Rome. He looks to medieval Florence. He reads the works of the classical Republican writers, Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, Harrington, the English ones, Harrington, Sidney, Montesquieu, Rousseau in the 17th and 18th century. So he does a lot of his reading around there. And I suppose he divides his analysis into two periods: ancient and medieval, and modern states. Ancient Greece or Athens is identified with democracy, and the Roman Republic is identified with a mixed constitution in which different powers balanced against each other. So in a way, the American Republic's more like the Roman model, with a mixed constitution. You've got all these different parts: president, Congress, Senate, etc., all balancing out, supposedly. Marx also recognizes the medieval republics, such as in Florentine, and the English and French republics. He discusses in Critique the relative merits of the three states that republicans take: the monarchical one, which is the rule of one person; the aristocratic one, which is the rule of a few; and democracy, the rule of the many. And Marx says that Marx defends democracy unchecked by any aristocratic or monarchical element. And he thinks at this time that democracy, he says, is the genus constitution. I don't know what you mean by the genus constitution. So it says that sometimes these three types appear together alongside each other: monarchy, the aristocracy, and the democratic. But he says that democracy, if you like, is the mother and father of all constitutions. The other ones are merely degenerations, poor offsprings of the original one. So I suppose he's going back to Greece to think that's the origin. We compare everything with what was achieved there, or that's how I understand what he's saying. So democracy is not just one amongst many constitutions. It's the mother and father of all of them. That's what I've understood him to be saying. And therefore, he goes into discussing, and I'll have to go back to PowerPoints for a second to get to this point. He discusses something called concrete versus abstract, and free or unfree states. And that's quite a useful thing to do. So if I can get back to my screen share a second, I can find a little diagram for us to help us in here somewhere. Let's just get to share. Let me just race through this a second. That's the one I'm looking for. Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Hopefully you can. Okay, so Marx classifies all states as concrete and abstract, they're on the top, or free and unfree. So, and the difference between them is that a concrete state is one where everybody participates in it. And an abstract state is one where we're kind of alienated from the state and kind of outside of it. So he describes Greece as a concrete state because everybody participates in it. Every day, democracy is a daily activity that they all participate in. All right, so they're all directly, democracy seems like a daily necessary activity in life. But it's unfree because these freedoms don't apply to women, slaves, and peasants. So Athens was very democratic, but this applied to about 30,000 out of 300,000 people. There were 10 to 20,000 chattel slaves working in the Athenian silver mines, and an estimated 80 to 100,000 slaves in total. So Greek democracy was real and concrete, that people were part of it, were part of their daily life, but they excluded the majority of the unfree populations. Okay, so if you were looking at America or the UK, you would say that, well, America and the UK were free in this sense that everybody has now, anyway, not back then, but everybody now has the right to vote. Everybody has the right to participate in voting, but it's not a daily activity. Politics has become a separate sphere of activity from daily life. So we might be butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, but we're not politicians. There are professional politicians and they do the politics, but the rest of us do politics occasionally or part-time or in addition to that. So the politics, the state is alien. We're not part of the state. The state appears as something else. So we may be free, but the state is abstract. If you took something like apartheid South Africa, it would be unfree in the sense that there were many people were excluded altogether, and it would be an abstract state in the same sort of way. So when Marx looks at the American Republic, he thinks it remains an abstract, he calls it a political state, but he recognizes it's closer to democracy than anywhere else. He rejects it because of this fact that most people don't get to participate in any really daily sense in life. They are kind of excluded from it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just thinking about participation and this idea between how the structure creates a division between civil and social life in a way. That's something, you know, as you've said, that he's very concerned about and very interested in. And just kind of this fundamental idea that people should have a say in the political decisions that shape their life, but not only that, they should be the actors in those decisions, even making those decisions in some sense. So there's a quote also from Critique of Right where he says, "No one ever heard of the Greek or Roman statesman taking an examination." And the text that I read that is this idea that's then very influential later on, but this idea that every cook can govern, so to speak. Folks can play these roles. And then also just very briefly, this your discussion about the monarchy, the aristocracy, and democracy, perhaps in some sense existing at the same time. You know, I think you see that idea laid out in the U.S. Constitution, at least, where it creates, you know, the president, the rule of one, the Senate, the rule of the few, and then the House of Representatives, in theory, the rule of the many. And we can critique, of course, how that plays out, but you see how all these ideas, are still, so current.
Yeah.
So I know we've been going on for about 40 minutes or so now, but I was just kind of curious if you, were to sum up some of your points, or go ahead.
I think I'll try to speed up at this point, and I will speed up by simply because we'll come back to this. At this point is important in understanding the Jewish question, but I'll get onto that in a second. I think that helps to add to that. But the idea that abstraction means we're alienated or excluded from it. I'll briefly sum up on just one more PowerPoint what I think are the key things of Marx's republicanism at that point, and I've got 4 of them here. Opposition to absolute and constitutional monarchy. Very much opposition to the state bureaucracy. Now, by the way, Hegel thinks the state bureaucracy is a universal class. They're running society on behalf of everybody, and Marx attacks that position and dismantles that position. And it links to the idea that Marx thinks that the working class is going to be the universal class, not the state bureaucracy. Then he's very, very strong on popular sovereignty, everything coming from the people, and the active participation of people in there, as in the Greek case. And he thinks that democracy is the best constitution of all of those arrangements. Now, all of those key points I could talk quite a bit about, but I won't. We'll move on from those. But it's a quick summary of, I think, those things that Marx carries over. But I want to briefly talk about the Jewish question and then come to the end. So let's just move on a little bit. Come on for a second. I've got anything on the Jewish question? Yeah, I have got one little slide on that. Making a little bit of progress now. Okay, the Jewish question. So Marx's writings on the Jewish question concerns the transition from pure republicanism towards socialism. That's where he's trying to make this transition. Marx doesn't abandon his republicanism. He's moving in that direction. His politics can be described, it has been described as being kind of Republican socialist, republicanism on the way to it, in transition towards it, but not pure Republican. The Jewish question is a response to a fellow young Hegelian, Bruno Bauer, who argued that Jews should give up their religion because political emancipation, freedom, requires the renunciation of religion. And so I think what we're having here is some idea of a confusion between atheism, where you've given up religion, and secularism, where you haven't. Atheism means emancipation of society or the renunciation of or freedom from religion. So Marx makes this distinction at this point between human emancipation and political emancipation. He thinks that republicanism brings political emancipation, but not human emancipation. So he discusses the split between the state, the one we've been talking about, the political state and civil society, which is characteristic of modern states. Take, for example, the American Republic. In the political sphere, the state has no official religion. It is freedom from religious persecution. But in civil society or private life, you can have whatever religion you want. It is as if religion has become privatized. People have a secular political life and a religious private life. So in a way, secularism is the political emancipation of the state from religion. There is no official state religion. A secular republic, therefore, is not the emancipation from religion, but a free market in religion. And you can think of the free market in religions in America, most extremely in tele-evangelism, for example. But Marx says that in a feudal state like Germany, the Jewish question remains a theological dispute between rival religions within a Christian state. Marx says that in the modern state like Britain, religion is still a constitutional matter because we're a Protestant state. So he thinks that in Britain we have political emancipation is, as it were, in half measure. So he goes on with that argument. So the conclusion here is that a secular republic There is political emancipation because every citizen has equal rights in relation to the state. However, it is not equal in the non-state or civil society, which is privatized and where we live our private lives. Hence, we are citizens in public life, but we remain in our private life, the merchant, the day laborer, the landowner, etc. Hence, Donald Trump is a US citizen and equal in political life to every other American. Even as president, he speaks my fellow Americans as an equal. But in his private life, he's a multimillionaire, and thus very different from the dire poverty that many fellow Americans are living in. So the conclusion that Marx makes is that Jews can be politically emancipated in a secular republic and can be free to practice their religion without persecution. But this is not human emancipation from religion. And hence the subordination of people to God or the crown is the service of class rule. So he's arriving at that sort of conclusion in the secular state. So he's in favor of a secular state, by the way, but he says really what we don't get is we don't get human emancipation from that, which you can see is where he's now going towards communism and the idea of human emancipation. As we're pressed for time, Luke, I'll go on to my ending, I think now, comrades, if that's all right, which is going to say this, I think. Do I have another one? The turning point. Yes, I've got another little slide, so I'll just do this. I want to start with in 1843, Marx goes to Paris and comes in contact with socialists and Paris workers, and it has a very big impact on him. He left Germany as a radical Republican interested in socialism, but his ideas underwent a rapid transition. There's a quote from Engels writing in the Owenite paper, The New Moral World, in November 1843. He says this: German communism, says Engels, emerged from the young Hegelians who were originally committed Republicans, but by developing further down the logical road become communists. Engels says he hopes the remainder of the Republican Party will convert to communism. And one of the people he's thinking about there, obviously, is Marx, because Marx is one of those people. We can go back to the Lyons workers uprising in 1834. Marx now says in 1844, the Lyons workers believed they were pursuing only political aims. They were soldiers of the Republic, whereas actually they were soldiers of socialism. So Marx links republicanism with socialism and suggests subjectively they're Republicans, but objectively they are fighting for socialism. And in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx recognizes that he talks about communist activity, which achieves the abolition of private property. Communism itself is identical with a positive abolition of private property, and thereby all the alienations institutionalizing the division of existing societies. So quite clear at that point, he's now become a communist. And then, of course, we've got the Communist Manifesto. And I'm going to end with this but, because it leads on. But the but is this. Engels believes that republicanism has gone, but this is premature, because what we have to do is to look at the Communist Party in Germany in 1848. And I'm not going to say what the Communist Party in Germany 1848 says, because I'm going to leave that up to Kevin next week. But Kevin will, I'm sure, address whether the 1848 revolutions push republicanism aside or not, but we'll see that. But certainly that's the direction of travel that's taking place there. Am I finishing at that point? Oh, awesome. Yeah, I have got one more. Let's give this last one. There we go, at the end, but only till next week. Marx and the 1848 revolutions. Yeah. Let me stop screen sharing.
Okay, comrades. I've put just a little message on there. If you want to raise a point or make a contribution, please use the raise hand function. Just while Steve and Luke are taking a break and I'm waiting to bring people in. Oh, I see I've got a couple of people, so I won't take too long. It's a question to both of you, and it's really about Marx's relationship with the Enlightenment. There's a nice big one. But in particular, the argument that Marx, Marx's critique of, say, the French Revolution, in particular, critique of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and in particular, how he starts to arrive at the idea that political democracy or pure political democracy is insufficient. And both of you have referred to the Jewish question, where he's particularly talking about, human emancipation, and increasingly, argues that human emancipation cannot simply be developed out through, through political democracy, but requires, a different form of property relations. And I suppose this is also linked to, I suppose, in terms of, texts like the German ideology, but also in the 1844 manuscripts, is where increasingly he's critiquing bourgeois individualist ideas of man as a citizen, as an individual, and in particular placing man as a social being, political animal, but extending that from the purely state realm into the economic and social. But I'll go over to the three comrades who've put their hands up. What I'll do is I'll take a number of contributions and then ask Steve and Luke to respond. Okay, so we'll do it like that. Okay, Joanne Telfer first, please. Joanne? Okay, we don't seem to be able to get Joanne. I'll move on to Ian Spencer. Ian, would you like to come in?
Is that it? Am I in? Good evening, and thank you, comrades. Just a couple of little things. First of all, Marx grew up in the Rhineland, which was the bit that came most under the influence of the Code Napoleon. And of course, he was absolutely imbued with the ideas of the French Revolution. And, a whole generation of people in Germany regarded Napoleon as a potential liberator, only to, of course, take the crown himself. It always has to be remembered that Beethoven was going to dedicate the Eroica Symphony to Napoleon until he took the crown. But what I really wanted to come on to, of course, is that both the Jewish question and the contribution to the critique of the philosophy of right were both written in 1843. And of course, famously in the critique of the philosophy of right, Marx is talking about the need to create a world where there's no need for religion. Religion, which is the heart of the heartless world, the sire of the oppressed creature, and so on, the opium of the people. So the aim is not, the society should be liberated from the need for such illusions. But the other thing I wanted to come on to was, you mentioned a little bit about, I know it's for next week, 1848 and so on, but of course Louis, when he talks about the monarchy, Marx is drawing distinctions between different types of monarchy, in a sense, or different monarchs in particular. I mean, he talks about Louis Bonaparte as a bourgeois king. Here is a person in the form of a monarch, but who is actually pushing forward the interests of the bourgeoisie rather than the aristocracy. And then one other little point I just wanted to make was about fascism. There was suggested that maybe we could be moving towards fascism. I would argue not because I think we're heading. Rosa Luxemburg famously used to talk about, we face the possibility of socialism or barbarism, and Istvan Mezaros used to make me laugh when he used to talk about At the moment, it's looking like we'll get barbarism if we're lucky. Well, fascism came into being at a particular time for particular reasons. I mean, where was it? Spain, Germany, Italy. So countries each which had the potential for socialistic revolution or revolutions which were dominated by socialists, that potentially there was the possibility of workers taking power, but at the same time had a large petit bourgeoisie. And in a sense, fascism was the expression of the kind of cri de coeur of the petit bourgeoisie, caught as they were between the proletariat and the haute bourgeoisie. We don't have that position now, and they don't have that position in the United States. It doesn't mean to say that what we might have is some brutally authoritarian regimes. I mean, if we look at Orban and in Hungary, for example, I mean, the fact that he's drawing upon a long existing authoritarian tradition. Of course, Horthy in Hungary too was a fascist, and of course Hungary too had its own brief Soviet republic, and there was a sizable petit bourgeoisie for Horthy to appeal to. The point I'm making is that I think we are moving towards a situation with increasingly authoritarian regimes, but it's not calling it fascism, apart from as an epithet, doesn't particularly help. I think it's best to try and understand it as it is, rather than give it an oven-ready label, to quote that monster that was probably on trial the other day. Anyway, those were the points I just wanted to make briefly, but I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion so far, and long may it continue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Joanne.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have to unmute though. How do I unmute?
No, you're fine.
Oh, right, you can hear me.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, that was a thumbs
Right.
up. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I've not actually come across this approach before. You know, this kind of a way of looking at Marx through various stages, which include republicanism. Interesting. I mean, as long as we all arrive at the same point, at the same point through different methods, to me that's important. I mean, I have come across a chopping up of Marx's work into stages in the personage of Althusser. But that was completely different, because I think Althusser uses his rather stupid insistence on an epistemological break to kind of attack humanism. This was something that was very current at the time of the publication of the economic manuscripts. Some of the terminology is a bit different. I think myself, freedom and democracy are things that are often put out as abstract concepts. You know, people on the television, crowds of people demanding freedom, and what they have in mind is abstract freedom. When of course, you know, freedom has to be concrete. It has to be people have to be free in practice, not just in theory. And the same goes for democracy. Democracy has to be practical, otherwise it becomes a sham, as we have under the current situation. It's not something that people as a whole practice in their daily lives, that they go to the polling station every 5 years and so forth. We turn into the French Revolution. There's an important difference when we talk about dictatorship. What I tend to think of in terms of the rise of Bonaparte in France is this is a fairly new category at the time. It was what we would call a form of Bonapartism, which is a different term from dictatorship. And I think this is important because people will talk about the bourgeois press, the bourgeois media will talk about dictators around the world and making no distinction from between them, and imagining that these are just evil people that have no roots in history, which of course for Marxists is absurd. Bonapartism arises, I would say, when when a class lacks hegemony, when it might be the dominant class in society, but it's not universally accepted as a dominant class. And hegemony is a process which takes quite a period of time to establish. I think hegemony was established in the West, but it took decades and maybe centuries to come about, and that was the hegemony of the bourgeois class, of course. I think in Russia there's lots of post-revolutionary Russia. There was lots of discussion about hegemony because it was seen as being really important. But a hegemony of the working class in Russia failed to materialize. It became, after the Civil War and after the death of Lenin, it became, just a means of controlling the situation without being able to extend democratic rights to the masses, because the regime was still unstable from external pressures. I think the term vanguard was used, and yes, I can see that in France, the working class was the vanguard of the overthrow of the aristocracy in France. But it also comes up in a different sense when we talk about a vanguard being necessary for the working class movement, because I think there are differences of consciousness within the working class, and that you need the most class conscious workers to take the lead in developing wider support for the ideas of socialism. Finally, on the Jewish question, another point I'll slip in. When Marx, between in what year was it? 1844, 1842. Marx is in his early 20s, so this would be a natural development of any person that was becoming a political figure or a political force for change. So between the ages of 24 and 26, we see this transition from what's been described as republicanism to communism, and that's a very short period of time. So that was the mature Marx at that time at 26, and that's the Marx I know and love.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. Gil Schaefer, next, please.
Okay, thanks. I'm in the United States. I got 3 points. First, Steve, great presentation. Okay. So here's my thing. It's kind of odd. It's good to establish that Marx was a democratic Republican. That's good, because Marxists for 100 years have forgotten that. Lenin too, Luxemburg too, they were all democratic Republicans. And there's been a revival of that understanding. It's taken some time. Hal Draper, Richard Hunt, Neil Harding, all the work they did in the 60s and 70s, work in the history, bringing back the democratic Republican strand is really important. However, Marx did not invent the democratic republic. He was not the originator of the critique of monarchy. The English and the French cut off kings' heads. Everyone knew it. Marx is kind of in this backward area, trying to catch up with more advanced political developments in other parts of the world. I'm in the United States. We had Tom Paine. We had the Declaration of Independence, which of course Marx knew about and read. We don't need Marx to learn about democratic republicanism in the United States. It's good to break the illusions about Marxism that have developed. But we had Paine, we had the American Revolution, we had the First Workers' Party, we had the abolitionists, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. And yet we still don't have democracy. We don't have a democratic republic. We have an aristocratic republic.
Yeah.
It is so much more backward now than Europe or Britain because, of course, the Second World War and the establishment of the American Empire. And so our situation here, and going back to the Jewish question and Marx saying political liberation is not human liberation. Now that's true. Okay. However, it's overlooked, I think, how gaining human liberation can only come through the expansion of political liberation. They're not opposites. Now, I believe Steve made that point. I agree totally. Anyway, those are the observations I wanted to make. I really like Steve's emphasis on republicanism. It's been missing for so long in the history. And I had one personal question, and I remember, I think some 20 years ago, Steve in a Weekly Worker article mentioned Neil Harding. Maybe I'm mistaken, I can't find the reference now, but are you familiar with Neil Harding's work and his analysis of Lenin's political thought? Because that's also a reestablishment of democratic republicanism in Marxism.
Yeah, so
thanks.
I can briefly answer that one without going back on. Just quickly answer that. Yes, I read both. I think there were 2 volumes of it. I read it in the 80s when I got interested in Lenin and trying to work out Lenin's democratic and republican ideas. So I don't know if it's in a Weekly Worker article. I don't know, but definitely influenced me back in the 80s. It was, I think.
Okay. I'll just take the next 2 comrades, Matthew and then Murray, and then I'll bring Steve and Luke back in to respond.
Hi, comrades. No, the problem with this is, it leaves out so much because actually, of course, the prime point is, of course, that it comes from Hegel. And to discuss Marx without you mentioning the word dialectic is a travesty. You can't do it. Actually, of course, it's about Hegel's philosophy. While Hegel himself, of course, was an idealist and wound up actually extraordinarily becoming a servant of the Prussian state, and actually thought the Prussian state was the greatest thing in all mankind. What Marx does is to say, as he says, to take the sort of the core of Hegel, strip it out, get rid of some of the stuff around about it, and then put it right way up. And then to marry it to a materialist view of the world as opposed to an idealist view of the world, and that's his innovation in those terms. And it's also about an ontology, an understanding of the arc of human history. So as he goes through, you look at the early works. Things like the German ideology or Holy Family or the economic and philosophical manuscripts. He's saying, okay, well, humanity obviously there's this arc of humanity, and we move towards the liberation of humanity from class oppression, and goes through history, and particularly obviously the impact of the French Revolution is clear, as has been said. That's correct, and particularly obviously from his point of view, as a Rhinelander, where that essentially the Rhineland, of course, supported the French Revolution against the sort of satrapies and ridiculous minor monarchies they were subjected to. They supported, the French Republic and saw the French army as liberators in many ways, which they were, in those terms. But it's then, of course, to say, okay, well, what he then does is to say the other innovation, as against the young Hegelians, is to say, right, okay, well, the agency of all this is the working class. It's the working class that's the core of this, and it's actually that dispossessed class, that will finally finish off the whole nature of the class oppression in human society and liberate the whole of humanity from that position. And really, that's there's a sort of this thing, in terms of, as has been pointed to by one of the comrades previously, Althusser and some of the Stalinists, towards saying, well, there's this young Marx and an old Marx. And I mean, of course, that you can see this, of course, is a travesty. I mean, you can see that basically Marx develops from his beginnings and basically develops in a single line. And okay, he elucidates a great big huge notion that he's going to look at all of society and so on, the rest of it, and he starts correctly from political economy and doesn't really manage to even finish all of capital, because obviously he gets diverted and all the rest of it. He was great at writing and he wrote huge amounts of stuff, but he's very bad at getting anything to the state to be published. As we see, I mean, they're still publishing Marx now. Marx is still being published now for the first time. So that work is going on. So you've got volumes and volumes and volumes of it. But the point being is the early stuff. I mean, he actually talks about, if you read these early works, he talks about being a revolutionary communist and the requirement for a communist revolution. I mean, I cannot. I mean, obviously, Steve has an obsession with republicanism, but it doesn't really come out if you read Marx, because Marx, if you read the early Marx, he talks about being a revolutionary communist. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I've just noticed other comrades have put their hand up, but I'll take Murray and then Nick, and then I'll ask Luke and Steve to respond, and then I'll bring other comrades in the next round. Okay, Murray, please, next. Murray, you're muted. Murray.
Unmute. Unmute. Am I unmuted? Is that liberation or is that a disaster? I guess my problem in trying to understand all this is picks up on the point that Luke made about the moment that the state ceases to be an expression of the will of the people, it becomes a parody, or what actually did you say, Luke? It becomes an obstacle to the people's will because it is now a formal expression of something which mediates between the abstract totality of political forces, the abstract totality of the forces of production, and the individual who apprehends this in some way, and it's only through participating in the state that the negotiation of an ethical relationships can be achieved and some kind of meaning can be put to the whole purpose of what we're talking about, which was, I think, something to do with overcoming the alienation. So I'd really like to pick up on where I'd really like to ask Luke, what was that the state became as soon as it ceases to be the expression of the will of the people in a revolutionary moment, which we know is a totally unstable moment, and it gives way to a whole formal system, which is emerges out of the counter-revolution. And the way people understand all this is through their individual understandings. They think of it in the terms that Marx criticizes as being as lacking any comprehension of this dialectical mediation between the absolute, whether it's in the feudal monarchy. Well, it comes historically through the state goes through these cycles, and which, as I get it, we're still trying to achieve an adequate form of republicanism. Sorry, but thank you for all your thinking that you've put into this. It's been really good.
Okay, thanks, Murray. Okay, last comrade for this round, Nick Rack.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Chair. Comrades, I've struggled with understanding the way in which the discussions has been presented. And I'll try to elaborate why. And I'll posit a suggestion, because having participated in these meetings since they began of Mr. Couple, and knowing Steve for a long time, and listened to Steve over many decades and talked with him, it is my assessment that Steve has a completely exaggerated and disproportionate approach to the question of republicanism. And in the nature of this presentation, I think it comes across. It's possible to be a Republican without being a communist. It is not possible to be a communist without being a Republican. That's the first thing. And the danger is that in the emphasis on republicanism or the democratic republic, without explaining the class nature of what you're talking about, then communism disappears. At one stage, there was a reference to Bruno Leopold, who I haven't read, but I've read Précis and tried to understand what he was saying. But I think it was either Luke or Steve said it, that the idea that he puts forward is that Marx was first a Republican and really didn't become a communist until 1871 after the Paris Commune. Or that Marx was a Republican at the beginning, became a communist, but became a Republican communist at the time of the Paris Commune in 1871. And like Joanne, who spoke a short while ago, I think I share her approach. What Steve is doing, it seems to me, is taking a period before Marx became a communist, when he became politically active, which is about a 2-year period from when he became involved in the Rheinische Zeitung, became its editor, and became involved and interested in democratic struggle because as a journalist and as a writer, he struggled with the censor. There was no democracy at the time, and he struggled with the right to write, where the autocracy tried to stifle the liberal journalism of a section of the liberal intelligentsia, if you like. And Marx began to confront this, and in his own intellectual development, he confronted his own past. He confronted the young Hegelians because they were not interested in politics, and Marx was, and he recognized the centrality of politics and the the political aspect of the struggle, and Marx having to write about political struggles, both of a democratic nature and of a class character, led him to read extensively into the existing socialist and communist literature. And that began in about 1842. And by 1844, when he had 10 days together with Engels, the two of them were already communists and they became lifelong collaborators. It's important for Marxists to defend Marx as a democrat, as a democratic political activist, and as a Republican, because our opponents try to portray Marx and Marxism as some sort of dictatorial ideology, as you could have seen in the Soviet Union. And that, of course, has nothing to do with Marx. But the republicanism or the democratic issues that Steve has been talking about, of course, they stretch throughout Marx's writings. There's a very, very good book, which I would recommend, by a man called August Nimtz. It's called Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough. And he goes through their writings and their political activity throughout their lives, including, I don't want to trespass on 1848 and beyond, but it was a constant theme in their writing. But by 1843, 1844, Marx and Engels had become communists. And they understood that the liberation of humanity was not achieved simply through republicanism, but through communism and through the class struggle and the socialist transformation of society. And the danger of approaching it, it seems to me, in this way, is to strip, as I said earlier, that aspect of Marx's political life, which was his whole life, and of Engels' whole life, and reduce it to a radical republicanism. Now, Glyn mentioned about the Democratic Republic and about the interregnum in the English Revolution of the 17th century. I mean, it's a fascinating period, but it was not the struggle for socialism. It was a different period, a different era, different class struggle. And as Glyn said, you can have a democratic republic and it's nothing to do with socialism unless you actually add that to the content of what you're talking about. And what I can't understand really is why there's such an emphasis on republicanism to the detriment of the communism, in my opinion. So that when Steve put forward one of his grids at the beginning of his talk, and he had his perspective, which I share Ian's disagreement over it, but he's got at one end fascism, and at the other extreme, not communism, but republicanism. I don't really understand that. If you look at if Steve's perspective were correct, say we were going through the 1930s, then what we had was a class struggle between the working class attempting to achieve a revolution to overthrow bourgeois capitalist society and fascism. And at the other extreme, we had fascism of Mussolini and Hitler. And the working class overwhelmingly went in one direction, the petty bourgeois section of the working class and the bourgeois went in the other direction. But why don't we talk openly about the fact that what we need is not some abstract classless republicanism, but we need communism. And actually the launching pad for that could be Britain with a constitutional monarchy, France with a constitutional republic, or any variant of bourgeois society in between. Society at the moment is rotten ripe for socialism, the only thing is lacking is not this or that extension of democracy now, particularly, but the consciousness in the working class that they've got the power to change things. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I've only got one more hand up, so what I'll do, although it's going to stretch your responses, comrades, I'm going to bring in Anne McShane and then ask if any other comrades want to come in to respond further. Okay, Anne, if you'd like to come in, and then we'll go back to Steve and Luke to respond to the various comrades who've asked questions.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. So my feedback is that at the beginning of the discussion, I found it hard to focus on exactly what we were trying to get out of the debate. But then I became clearer as Steve spoke and distinguished different forms of republic. Marx's analysis of, I suppose, a republic which was actually genuinely democratic, or a state of affairs which was genuinely democratic. And so I thought that was interesting, because that coincides with the view of Marx and of Marxists of democracy being real as opposed to abstract, or in some way curtailed, or in some way like limited to the ruling class, which is the minority. And it then, instead of being something where you just go and vote every now and again, it becomes a real part of your life. So then, therefore, my response to Nick, I think, is that although I've often, as Steve knows, been critical of him, my criticism would be more of a kind of a stages approach. I disagree with him on Marx becoming a communist at the period of the Paris Commune. I think it was much earlier, but obviously they were learning and developing as a team. I don't think it was just Marx, as a team throughout a period of history. And those struggles, taught them, and they developed their ideas. And obviously they were involved as well. But I suppose just to make it clear, is what I think is most interesting is the concept of the democratic republic being the ideal vehicle for the working class to come to power and to rule in the early days of a workers' state. So therefore, it's not about republicanism like for the sake of republicanism. It's about republicanism as being that ideal formation, because you don't have the problems of a sovereign. But then that doesn't obviously equate with just saying that every republic is, what's the word, is the ideal vehicle for the working class to take up that struggle. The working class has to struggle for a democratic republic as the way in which to become the ruling class. And in that sense, democracy is the only way that the working class can come to power, and the only way that the working class can rule and become conscious. So when you say, Nick, that there's no need for kind of discussions around democracy at the moment, I think that you said something like that, I could have you wrong, and that the working class needs to be convinced. But how does the working class move from a situation of knowing in their heart and souls that this society has to change to becoming a ruling class, and that has to be through democracy? So for me, I think that that's the most important angle on the question, and I think I would differ from Nick in terms of what he put forward. Anyway, thank you. Thanks for letting me in, Kevin. Very good.
No censorship here, Anne, I think. Okay, there's a lot there for for Steve and Luke to get their teeth into, so I'll give you a chance to respond, and then I'll bring in any other comrades who put their hands up. Okay.
Okay. Shall I start off? After a while, your brain starts filling up with so much stuff. You think, what I'm going to say now? I'll go back to Ian first of all. I think Ian, and then Joanne, then Gil and Matthew. I'll start with Ian then. Well, I think the point about religion, I don't think I'm in disagreement there. The point about secularism is not human liberation. It's not the liberation. It's not human emancipation. Secularism is political emancipation. They're not the same thing. Obviously, they're not the same thing. But we're in favour of political emancipation, and it can be a step towards it. As part of the struggle for human emancipation, political emancipation has to be part of that. So we're possibly not disagreeing now, because I can't remember the point. But Ian did say, are we heading towards fascism? I think the point about my thing at the point at the beginning is to say the present economic and political system has been in such a broken state since the financial crisis of 2008, since the austerity, since the Scottish independence referendum, where nearly 45% wanted to leave the UK, since the Brexit vote, since we've had, I don't know how many, I've actually lost count of how many Tory prime ministers you've had. They have one every year or so, or even less than that. This is a sign of a system in a deeper crisis. We've never seen anything like it. And all our social and political institutions are in a deep crisis. And what I was trying to say was, it's not the case that the only democratic answer to this is either we have fascism or we just hobble on with the present broken system. We've got to pose a democratic alternative in the crisis of democracy. And what should that democratic alternative be? I mean, even if you read Gordon Brown, he's addressing those questions, how to patch up the constitutional monarchy and make it work a bit better. That's what he's saying. And I think that's a utopian project, because my argument is we're beyond that now, unfortunately. We are beyond that. So I think we'd be wrong to just say I didn't define fascism, by the way. And I don't think there's any fascist party about to take power. I don't think fascism is coming right now or next week or next year. The actual fascist parties are tiny, fringe parties. But you don't really know where, in a crisis, where fascism will come from. It may not come from the obvious places. I keep my eye on Boris Johnson at some point, because of the nature of the crisis, trying to lead some populist authoritarian movement, because fascism is the destruction. I mean, fascism is not coming to power as populism, it's coming to power with the aim of destroying working class democracy and destroying liberal democracy and all our rights and freedoms. It's not there, but we have to be aware that I think there is a tendency. And if you go back to the 1930s, they say this. Think what was happening in the 1930s, a fight between republicanism and fascism in Spain. In Italy, there was a battle going on between fascism, constitutional monarchy, that ended in a republic. The Weimar Republic was in crisis. So if you look back to that, you can see that democratic arguments are there in all of that. It's the recognition of a crisis of democracy that seems to me means that we're in a different epoch. That's what I want to get over. We're not in just continuation of the situation that we've been in before. We're in a different period. And everything should tell us that, and we can see that ourselves. It doesn't mean me to do that. Now, I don't know if Luke wants to say anything about what Ian said. Did you want to say anything, Luke?
I've got lots to say. Are we focusing on Ian for the moment? Or?
Well,
I'm happy to let you continue with all of your comments, and then I can come in.
Is that okay with you, Kevin? Should we go person by person?
That's fine. That would be the easiest way. I've only got two comrades who want to come in.
Okay. So, trying to remember now, Joanne, what Joanne said. She spoke about young Marx and old Marx. I mean, and this slightly links to what Matthew said. We're trying to trace Marx's thought, the evolution of Marx's thought, in a dialectical way, not in a straight line. I mean, he wasn't, but he was born in 1818. He didn't wake up in 1820 when he was 2 and start talking about communism, obviously. Obviously, he had to develop his ideas, and the thing that shaped his ideas was the French Revolution and Hegel. So that's where we have to start. I certainly didn't say he didn't become a communist until 1870. What I said was he was becoming a communist and fully embracing communism by 1844. And clearly the Communist Manifesto in 1847, what I think it was, that clearly shows where he was. So I'm discussing not, what type of republic do we want to have? I'm just discussing here the fact that he was a Republican at a certain point of time and then he became a communist. And the point is, and I think the point is that some of his Republican aspects never disappeared, and we will see that. And they get a big boost in 1870. So we're looking in the 3 talks in the dialectical evolution, thesis, antithesis, synthesis of Marx's thought in the context of the French Revolution, the 1848 revolutions, etc. But I use the word vanguard. I just mean by that a leading force, that you actually go out to try to lead, as opposed to following along in the, republicanism could come along. It could happen, and we could just say, well, we'll go along with that. We'll jump on the bandwagon. But leading means to say you go out and campaign, you go out and fight for it, you go out and agitate for it. And it's not enough just to say, well, we've got fascism or the constitutional monarchy. That's not a very good choice at all. Matthew. Well, Marx hadn't written, in 1844, Marx hadn't written Capital. He hadn't developed his ideas fully in any shape or form. So the point I'm wanting people to recognize is he was a Republican and he wasn't a communist at that point. And but he's in transition to that point. That's the thing. I don't know if that really Marx. I'm trying to look at my own notes. Hegel's important. Gill, well, Gill, is it Gill? Well, I agree with Gill, actually. I think I agree with what he said. And I'm pleased that, I'm pleased to hear his contributions. I can't really disagree with what he said. He's right to say, of course, Marx didn't invent republicanism. It came a long history. I mean, but Marx went back to study the history. He went back to the Greeks and the Romans. He went back to Machiavelli. He went back to the English Republicans. I didn't mention Tom Paine in that list, but he went back to all of those classical writers. Murray said the state is a barrier to, yes, I think, not sure if I've got anything to say particularly about what Murray said. The state is a barrier to human liberation. Well, we agree with that, which is why we believe we have to replace the state with a democratic republic. Now, we can argue what that means, but that's what happens, which is what Anne said. Now, Nick, of course, we've been arguing this a lot, as Nick pointed out. Nick and me have been discussing this over, and we haven't come to any more enlightenment either way. He says that you can be a Republican without being a communist, but if you're a communist, you must be a Republican. Well, what does he mean by that, to say you must be a Republican? Does it mean that you lead the fight? Does that mean that it's important? Or is it the case, somebody think, well, when socialism arrives, we'll go around to Buckingham Palace and say, right, here's your redundancy notices. We don't need to bother about the monarchy, simply because it'll just disappear in the revolution, be like the washing. This perspective says, no, we have to fight for democracy in the here and now in order to get to communism. It's about transitional politics. Transitional politics is where you have to go to get to the goal that you want. And if Nick and I both agree we're going to get to communism, how do we get there? What's the steps we have to take to get there? That's what transitional politics has to be about. But that transitional politics has to be rooted in historical and dialectical materialism. He's right to say, I think, that Marx was concerned practically with the censor, practically with what the Russian state, what the Prussian state was doing. But he was also intellectually engaged with the young Hegelians who were themselves Republicans. So he became a Republican with them, and then he transcended and went beyond them. He saw their limitations and he broke with them, of course. The problem, just to say this, Nick, the problem is that there isn't any republicanism in England. There's none, I would say. Left reformism doesn't have any. Corbyn didn't have any republicanism in him at all. Left reformism doesn't. And a lot of Stalinism doesn't either. And the problem in England is, unlike Ireland or Scotland or Wales, where you can see that, and many other countries, we haven't recovered from the 17th century yet. So till we do that, well, we're not going anywhere. And well, and I agree really with what Anne said, so I'm not going to say anymore. That's me. That's me done. I agree with Anne and I agree with Gil. And yeah, that's it.
Before I bring in Luke, we do have some timing and technical questions. So what I'm going to propose is this, please. If I bring in Caroline and Rob, and then I ask, another comrade, I'll bring in Ian for a very short contribution. Then I'll ask Luke to sum up. Okay, if that's fine.
That's fine.
That means everybody can then get a crack at this, but we've got a time limitation. Okay, so I'll bring in Caroline, Rob, and then Ian for a very short contribution, and then Luke can sum up. Caroline?
Yeah. Hi, Kevin. Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you to Luke and Steve. Hiya. I just had a question. I wanted to know, I thought Steve brushed over a bit the fact that there were communists around before Marx became a communist. Did you say Engels was a communist, or? And I'd just like to know what kind of, what was that, and a little bit more about that, please. Thanks.
Okay, Rob.
I'm glad Steve came back on some of the comments there, because I think I had kind of perceived the argument from the kind of perspective of, there's an undue weighting on the kind of notion of Marx as a Republican, given his conclusions later on, obviously, and all that kind of side of things. I'd say that there's a distinct kind of. I'd worry like Nick about the kind of elements of this that takes away from the fundamentals of, the current political model of the social relation, and how capital regenerates itself and becomes significant, which is really the power structure beyond the democratic processes that we are surrounded with. I use democratic loosely here. Representative democracy in itself is, it tends towards an abstraction from the populace. It tends towards an elitism, a cronyism that you can see rampant in our societies. I'd say that also it's important to I think Steve said that the system broke in 2008, and yes, there was a surface break in the system, but then what about social relations change? What about the deeper undercurrent of capital change in that breaking? Because those relations have been dominant for the past 150 years, if not longer, really. I don't think that's a significant break. I think it's created the current political miasma we're in at the minute, for sure. But that political miasma is a symptom of crisis of capital that is ongoing. And I'd say this crisis is nowhere near what it was back in the start of the 20th century. When you're looking at the 1910s, 1920s, about the kind of political upheaval that was happening at that time, it's much more of an ingrained crisis than the 2008 financial crisis. So I'd say it's got less weight there as well. So question really is what key features of Marx's conception of a democratic republic do you see going forward in society at the moment? What can we take from Marx about democratic republicanism that we can apply to our modern situation?
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what I found really interesting about Steve's presentation was, of course, something that often is not looked at, and that was Marx's development towards communism. But just to leave nobody in any doubt, my opinion is that republicanism, a wish to have a republic, republicanism is the political expression of capitalist social relations. You know, it's not for nothing that kings' heads are chopped off in England and France, because they are the feudal impediments to the development of full capitalist relations. And although in the context of Germany, with their princes and electors and whatever else, and of course the seniority of the Prussian monarchy, a democratic republic must have looked like a very thoroughly progressive step forward. And of course Hegel understood that, Beethoven understood that, Marx and Engels understood that. But to say that we're in favour of republicanism now is to say we're in favour of what exactly? We're in favour of the most perfect expression of bourgeois social relations. What I find interesting is, of course, that that democracy is worrying the bourgeoisie precisely because when you get someone like Corbyn comes along, basically a left Keynesianism pacifist at best, a thoroughly nice chap maybe, but nevertheless one who is wedded hand and foot to capitalism ultimately. But he was dangerous because it opened up the possibility that it might make it easier for workers to organise. And that's, of course, why we would naturally demand an extension of democracy. Of course we will, because workers need to be able to organise. You can't organise under, well, you can organise under conditions of illegality, and communists, of course, do. But that's not ideal. And what we want to see is not just bourgeois democracy, but the direct participative democracy of all working people. And from that point of view, republicanism is thoroughly retrograde. You know, the res publica, the republic in ancient Greece, was a democracy of property owners, people who at least owned themselves. Modern bourgeois society, we all own ourselves. We might own bugger all else, but we all own ourselves. Otherwise, we can't enter into the labour contract. So it's even an alienated form of politics, in the sense that we're all relating to one another as property owners through a contractual form. A socialist society would have direct human contact, direct human relations, not vitiated, not moderated through contractual forms. And from that point of view, the ownership of oneself is the essence of bourgeois law. And ultimately, we want to see the end of that, not because we want people to be enslaved, be the property of others, but because we want to see the end of bourgeois property relations, which would inevitably mean that if I relate to another human being, it's not because it's a contractual form, it's because it's a natural human form. And from that point of view, the need for direct participatory democracy is a vast leap ahead of bourgeois democracy. And just one final note on fascism in Britain. The British Union of Fascists, of course, led by a former Labour MP, Oswald Mosley, failed. But they didn't fail because of the moral superiority of the British. It's because we didn't actually have that much of a petty bourgeoisie. And because the interests of the haute bourgeoisie were already thoroughly represented by the Tories, and the working class was being marshalled behind the interests of capital by the Labour Party. There was no scope really for fascism in Britain. That doesn't mean to say that in future there won't be authoritarianism in Britain, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if the monarchy played a part in the usurpation of democratic power of any kind of limited democracy that we currently have. And that's why I'm completely in favour of a republic, completely in favour of the abolition of the monarchy. And how could you be anything other than a Republican if you were a socialist?
Could you wind up now?
That's it.
Ian,
That's it. Finished.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm just going to bring in Tina, and then Luke can do the final summing up. Okay, Tina.
It's all kicked off a bit, hasn't it? Towards the last 20 minutes or something.
I knew it would.
Yeah, sorry to leave it quite so late, but it's gotten quite interesting. I mean, why are we Republicans? And I've clashed with Steve on that as well, who I think has a certain bit of a touch of a fetishism about the Republic as something that is, by itself always a really progressive thing. I don't think there's anything naturally progressive in the Republic. I mean, the US is a republic, Israel is a republic, Germany is a republic, etc. They're not much more democratic than what we have in Britain. I think the key to understand Marx as a Democrat and not just as a Republican is to understand that he took every single issue seriously. He didn't just focus on the trade union struggle. He didn't just focus on we need to fight for the 8-hour wage, which he did as well, the 8-hour a day, which he did as well. But he didn't just do that. He also looked at the bigger issues, how we are ruled, why we are ruled by A, B, and C, and why that has to change. Yes, he did mention he did say that the Republic is the ideal form. I think Luke said that, or Ian, I can't remember now. The ideal form for the working class to take over, and that's why it's a good thing, etc. And that's why we should fight for it. But by itself, there's nothing that much democratic about it. Just means we need to take all these democratic issues seriously. The House of Lords, PR, electoral systems, etc. And the reason I think we, or some of us, are banging on about it so much is because of the rest of the left does exactly the opposite. They say monarchy, they cost a lot of money. That's the issue with having a monarchy in Britain, because it's so expensive. Rubbish. We should say that's a rubbish argument. The key question is, who rules over us? Should there be somebody born to rule over us? That is the key issue. That's why we're taking this seriously, because it goes to the heart of who runs society and on whose behalf, not just because, having a queen or having a republic is necessarily much, much better, because you can live in a shit state in a republic. But the rest of the left just focuses on, I don't know if that's Trotskyism or whatever, on economic demands. It's the trade union stuff. That's the big way to get the working class politicized. It's one way, but it's not the only way. And we're saying, we also have to focus on the democratic issues. And that's what we're trying to, some of us focus on, Marx, the Democrat, and Marx took all these issues very, very seriously. That's all I should have.
Yes, I was just going to remind you that we need to finish at 9, Tina. Okay, I'll ask Luke to sum up, please. You've got around about 7-8 minutes to do it, Luke.
Okay, I'll sum up, hopefully while also including kind of some of my own thoughts on these. One way to sum up is to, of course, plug that these issues continue and evolve in the future. So we run the risk of talking about how folks think of the Republic, and yet, in the future, as we'll get to, by the end, various words will be attached to Republic. We'll talk about labor republics, red republics, bourgeois republics, democratic republics. So lots of things get attached to that phrase. The question of contemporary relevance was asked. Some thoughts on that. I think, just because the system is rotten, so to speak, doesn't mean that a political alternative is clear to people. The rottenness of the system then doesn't necessarily point folks in the right direction. And I think that one way people get class consciousness is by fighting for democratic rights. And the working class is doing that. It's already doing that. This is a high point of Lenin that was actually pointed out to me. Lenin didn't read Capital to the workers, so to speak, in order to get them fired up. Lenin's project was not necessarily about explaining kind of the intricacies of the commodity, so to speak. It was more so about having an intransigent platform for the democratic republic against the opposition to what existed then. So that is a big part of what Marxism is, if anything, and this would be provocative, if anything, you could almost say, or one could say, whether or not they'd be right or wrong, that actually capital is the divergence from otherwise the continuous focus on politics. That's not to split things off, but I think you could just as easily turn the thing around and say not that republicanism or interest in politics was the divergence from otherwise Marx's contribution to the understanding of the domination of capital, but actually it kind of flipped, and actually a focus on the intricacies of capital came at a low point of the otherwise kind of political struggles. And we should also, of course, remember that capital is human relations. So these are all involved in the questions of human relations and of politics. I'll say also, to highlight again, that political liberation is insufficient in its own, but it's necessary, and you won't get to any higher form of liberation without fighting for that political liberation. And I think that then ties into this discussion of seeing things in kind of, well, the task now is a political revolution through which we can actually find ourselves on a higher, more favorable terrain to engage in the class struggle. The class struggle won't end once the working class comes to state power, but we need that in order to ever get anything higher. The concern, I think, about us forgetting perhaps the goal of communism, I think then is reasonably addressed by a minimum maximum program. And, I know it's not something that came up, but I think it's very relevant. If folks are concerned that talking about a democratic republic somehow takes away from communism, all of the programs, all of the best programs of socialist and communist parties have, rightly so, the demand for a democratic republic in their minimum program and communism as their maximum program. There's a clear understanding then of what the tasks are now and what our overall goal is then. And that's then arguably for why you would want to structure an organization around that structure. And then I'll end talking about what was brought up earlier on, this question of alienation. And the quote I'd read from Critique of Right was actually about the Constitution. And it was essentially that once the Constitution becomes something that doesn't represent the people, it's something that kind of stands in an alienated or more dominated way. And I think that's very interesting because the US Constitution is a document that in its first few sentences gives power to the people. It says, "We the people." Great. Now the rest of the document then proceeds to take all of those things essentially away. And so in that way, it is actually a very effective mechanism of control. It simultaneously grants freedoms while then also constraining the very discourse that one can have about what it even means to be free and whatnot. And then that discussion around alienation is so important. And I'll end by saying, as perhaps Tina was talking about in regards to the demands we make, the things we take on. So often when we talk about alienation, we focus on alienation in the workplace, alienated at the point of production. Okay, fine. But there's this large current of Marxism that connects alienation to the political sphere and says we are alienated by these repressive things that dominate us, and we've forgotten that they are made by us. And when we decide to make another one, we will have that power. That's not capital is not God. The Constitution is not God. So I'll end there.
Thanks very much, Luke, and thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for all the comrades who took part in the discussion, which did raise some interesting points, which I'm sure are going to return as we carry on going through. One thing that does strike me, and I'd like to thank both Luke and Steve for doing this, is particular references to the sort of selected or suggested texts. And I think this is very important that comrades do. Sorry, I'm starting to sound like a school teacher now about doing your homework, but I think it is important that comrades do, look at those texts. The aim of the session was to try to get people to think about the place of democracy in Marx's thought, and in particular in his politics. And that's going to come up next week when we look at 1848. Yeah, Steve,
Just one very brief thing. We are hoping to get Bruno Leopold to come and speak to us. We mentioned his thesis and the work that he's done on this topic. So keep an eye out. And we're also doing, the Republican Labour Working Group is doing a session on reading the third chapter of his thesis. So if comrades want to get in contact with us and want to come and join a reading group, for 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to do that. Coincidentally, by the way, because obviously we didn't know that when this session was starting. It was going to start on Tuesday, but apparently because something else is happening, we've put it back a week, I think, in discussion with Tina. But apart from that, because I think we've got Moshe Makova possibly coming on Tuesday. But
Okay, well, if you look on the Marx website, I'm sure you'll pick up on those details. And if comrades put their names in, they'll get circulated with all the various details and so forth. So thanks very much to all the comrades, and I'll see you next week. Luke and I will be looking at 1848. So a lot to get stuck into there. Okay then, well, good night and thanks once again. So see you all next week, comrades.